The night of December 27th plunged Kyiv into a crisis few could have predicted. Over 600 missiles and drones struck simultaneously, targeting residential areas, power plants, and key infrastructure. Sirens wailed for 17 continuous hours, driving civilians into subway shelters, while energy workers risked their lives to stabilize the city's faltering grid. This was not a random bombardment. It was a stark ultimatum from Moscow: surrender or endure the winter frozen and powerless. The question now gripping observers worldwide: could such an overwhelming strike break Ukraine's will, or would it ignite a strategic counter that reaches Moscow itself? While the world's attention was fixed on diplomatic maneuvering between the Trump administration and President Zelensky, Russian President Vladimir Putin seemed determined to demonstrate force. Intelligence reports confirmed that Kyiv's streets were flooded with panic and confusion, yet Ukraine's response was swift. Within hours, fleets of Lyuti and jet-powered drones penetrated deep into Russian airspace, marking the opening of a counter-offensive that NATO analysts would later call a demonstration of precision strike capability far beyond conventional expectations. Western military commentators noted that these operations highlighted Ukraine's evolution from defensive resistance to strategic deep strikes capable of undermining Russian infrastructure and logistics. The psychological and economic dimensions of this initial salvo were immense. Power outages in Kyiv threatened hospitals' heating systems and essential services in the midst of harsh winter temperatures. Energy economist Dr. Martina Kessler, speaking to DW News, emphasized that attacks on critical infrastructure in urban centers create cascading effects. A single strike against a power grid can paralyze economic activity, disrupt supply chains, and increase operational costs for firms across the region. NATO officials quietly confirmed that such disruption had immediate ramifications for Eastern European security, forcing neighboring states to reassess readiness measures. The Ukrainian retaliation was not merely symbolic. OSINT and satellite imagery indicate that the initial phase, known as the Kova Plan, forced Russian aviation authorities to close major airports in Moscow, including Vnukovo and Sheremetyevo. Flights were cancelled, rerouted, or left circling dangerously low on fuel. Thousands of civilians were stranded, trapped in terminals, and even aboard aircraft forced to endure freezing temperatures for hours. Aviation experts told Reuters that this incident represented one of the most dramatic civilian disruptions in modern European conflict history, a reminder that airspace control is a critical dimension of power projection. This duality, the simultaneous vulnerability of Kyiv and the penetration into Moscow's airspace, signals a shift in the strategic landscape. Ukrainian forces have leveraged swarm tactics, saturating Russian air defenses while minimizing their own losses. Analysts at Jane's Defense Weekly described the operation as a tipping point in the theater, exposing weaknesses in what was long considered a near-impenetrable air defense network. The ability to bring the fight to the heart of Russia demonstrates not only technical proficiency, but also strategic daring, forcing both domestic and international audiences to re-evaluate assumptions about the conflict's trajectory. As Kyiv struggled under fire and Russian citizens began witnessing the war from above their own capital, the broader implications became clear. The economic shock, civilian disruption, and the psychological blow of seeing national airspace violated set the stage for a larger confrontation with far-reaching NATO and global consequences. The night had transformed from a simple attack into a powerful statement. Ukraine was capable of striking back, and the Kremlin's narrative of invulnerability was crumbling. How long could Moscow maintain its grip while its own citizens endured chaos? That question now hung over both capitals like the drones buzzing in the cold winter sky. The dawn following Kyiv's harrowing night revealed a strategic reality Moscow had hoped to avoid. Ukrainian drones had penetrated deep into Russian territory, forcing an unprecedented closure of Moscow's international airports. Sheremetyevo and Vnukovo, long considered symbols of Russia's logistical and technological prowess, became scenes of chaos as planes were diverted, grounded, or left circling with dwindling fuel. Flight radar data confirmed more than 300 cancellations and dozens of emergency landings, while regional airports in Kaluga, Yaroslavl, and Volgograd were simultaneously closed. Civilian panic in terminals offered a stark visual. Russia's showcase city, often depicted as impervious, was now vulnerable in real time. The burning question reverberating across global news channels: if Ukraine can disrupt Moscow's airspace so efficiently, how resilient is the Russian homeland in the face of coordinated deep strikes? Western analysts immediately pointed out the wider implications for NATO and global logistics. A disrupted Moscow airspace directly affects trade routes, insurance premiums, and supply chains linking Russia to China, India, and other international partners. Economist James Caldwell told BBC that cargo flights diverted from Moscow impose significant economic costs. Every day that aviation hubs are non-operational translates into hundreds of millions in losses, not just for airlines but for industries reliant on Russian exports. NATO's emergency monitoring centers also began recalculating threat levels for adjacent Eastern European countries, acknowledging that the ability of drones to bypass traditional air defenses marks a significant escalation in asymmetric warfare capabilities. Technically, the Ukrainian strike utilized the Lyuty kamikaze drones in coordinated swarms, a tactic designed to overwhelm the S-400 and Panzer air defense batteries. Military analysts from Defense News note that while individual systems are formidable, simultaneous saturation attacks expose structural vulnerabilities in Russia's layered defense doctrine. The precision with which these drones reached Moscow reflects an evolution in Ukraine's unmanned systems program, from reconnaissance and limited tactical strikes to operational-level deep penetration, capable of causing cascading civil and military disruptions. OSINT imagery later confirmed drone pathways over heavily defended corridors, demonstrating not only technical capability, but also sophisticated mission planning and real-time intelligence integration. Psychologically, the effect on Russian citizens cannot be overstated. Images of stranded passengers, crowded terminals, and exhausted staff quickly circulated on social media, highlighting cracks in domestic confidence. Dr. Elena Novikova, a sociopolitical analyst, emphasized that these images erode the implicit social contract between state and citizen, where protection and normalcy were promised in exchange for compliance. The impact is particularly significant during winter, when heating and power shortages are immediately felt, magnifying the human cost, and feeding into a broader narrative of vulnerability that Western analysts believe Ukraine is intentionally projecting to reinforce diplomatic leverage. This operational success also signals a shift in the broader military balance. By demonstrating the ability to strike Russia's interior with limited risk to personnel, Ukraine has forced Moscow to divert resources traditionally deployed to the front lines. According to Jane's Defense Weekly, such strategic redistribution of air defense assets can slow offensive operations in occupied territories, demonstrating a clear interplay between tactical strikes and operational strategy. The attack's timing immediately preceding key diplomatic discussions between Trump and Zelensky also highlights the synchronized use of military and informational power to shape perceptions internationally, particularly regarding NATO readiness and U.S. strategic support. As the world digested images of stranded flights and shuttered airports, the message was unmistakable. Ukrainian forces could now project influence far beyond their borders, challenging Moscow's sense of invulnerability. The closure of airspace and disruption of logistics underscored a strategic vulnerability, with implications for NATO's defensive planning and Western energy security. Observers began to wonder, would Moscow be able to restore credibility and control, or was this a harbinger of escalating deep strikes targeting Russian infrastructure in key cities? The night's events were no longer just a warning, they were a test of state resilience, and the results were broadcast to the entire world. 700 kilometers southeast of Moscow, the Ukrainian counteroffensive struck a critical nerve, the Syzran oil refinery. This facility, a linchpin in supplying fuel to the Russian army, became the focus of a surgical strike that Western analysts hailed as a textbook example of modern deep strike strategy. Drones targeted the Iluavt-5 atmospheric distillation unit, the refinery's heart responsible for converting crude oil into gasoline and diesel. Disabling this single component effectively rendered the remainder of the complex inoperative. Satellite imagery and local footage captured flames and explosions lighting up the horizon, proving that Ukraine's strike went far beyond symbolic disruption. It was a direct blow to Russia's logistical lifeline. Experts immediately pointed out the implications. If Ukraine can cripple such vital infrastructure, how resilient is Russia's operational mobility across the front lines? Military analysts from Defense News and Jane's Defense Weekly noted that this attack demonstrated both precision and an understanding of strategic leverage. Rather than striking supply convoys or frontline tanks, Ukraine opted to attack the source of mobility fuel itself. By crippling Syzran, the Ukrainian forces imposed an asymmetric constraint on Russian operational tempo. This tactic is reminiscent of Western doctrines emphasizing the indirect targeting of an adversary's logistics to create cumulative effects that ripple through both military and civilian spheres. NATO strategists commented that such operations illustrate how modern conflicts increasingly rely on precision real-time intelligence and unmanned systems rather than sheer massed forces. The ramifications extended beyond military logistics. Regional fuel shortages quickly emerged in the Samara, Saratov, and Penza regions, with rising prices for gasoline and diesel affecting both civilian transport and agricultural production. Energy experts from Al Jazeera and the NYT highlighted the economic cascading effects. Interrupting a single refinery in winter has immediate humanitarian consequences, said Dr. Katarina Muller, an energy policy analyst. Heating costs, surge transportation becomes unreliable, and local populations bear the brunt, all while the state struggles to maintain normalcy. The civilian shock also amplified political pressure within Russia, highlighting the growing domestic cost of the conflict. Ukraine's drone swarms further revealed gaps in Russia's air defense network. Hundreds of Lyuti drones designed to overwhelm S-400 and Panzer batteries successfully reached their targets despite winter snow and strong winds. OSINT analysis confirmed that Russian forces struggled to coordinate an effective defensive response with each attack, forcing difficult trade-offs between protecting military assets and civilian infrastructure. NATO observers assessed that these operations signaled a new era of integrated unmanned warfare, capable of imposing both operational and psychological costs. The combination of physical damage and domestic panic created a multi-layered impact. While emergency services scrambled to extinguish refinery fires and maintain critical systems, the population experienced direct consequences: power outages, heating disruptions, and restricted fuel availability. Civilian experiences reinforced the perception of strategic vulnerability, undermining the Kremlin's narrative of control. Military analysts suggested that repeated attacks of this nature could force Russia to divert resources from offensive operations in Ukraine to homeland defense, effectively achieving operational paralysis without engaging in massed frontal assaults. As global media disseminated images of the burning refinery, the strategic message became clear. Ukraine was demonstrating both capability and intent. It could strike deep, target the lifelines of Russian military power, and create economic and social pressure simultaneously. The ripple effects challenged assumptions about Russian invulnerability and signaled NATO and Western policymakers that Ukrainian forces were increasingly capable of shaping operational conditions far from the front lines. The pressing question remains: if such precision strikes continue, can Russia sustain its operational momentum, or will internal logistical collapse redefine the battlefield? The impact of Ukraine's strikes extended far beyond military targets, seeping into the everyday lives of Russian civilians and unraveling the social fabric that underpins state authority. Airports remained closed, fuel shortages emerged, and power outages swept across major regions. Residents of Moscow and the Samara region faced a stark new reality. Elevators and water pumps ceased functioning. Central heating failed, and internet connections faltered under strain. In temperatures dipping below freezing, these disruptions were more than inconveniences. They were a humanitarian stress test imposed by conflict. Western analysts highlighted that such civilian hardships carry strategic weight. Economic and societal paralysis amplifies military pressure, said Dr. Liam Harper of the International Institute for Strategic Studies. By attacking critical infrastructure, Ukraine forces Moscow to defend its home front, effectively diverting attention and resources from the battlefield. The psychological impact was equally profound. Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Ryabkov's rhetoric about eventual victory was drowned out by images of drones exploding over the capital and citizens stranded in terminals shivering and helpless. Media reports verified by satellite imagery and OSINT investigations illustrated scenes of panic, long queues at gas stations, and frozen transport corridors. NATO intelligence sources noted that such domestic exposure could erode public confidence in the Kremlin, a strategic concern that Western experts argue may indirectly influence Russian military decision-making. The war, previously perceived by many Russians as distant, now loomed literally above their cities, transforming abstract conflict into immediate reality. Economically, the cascading effects were equally severe. The closure of airports and disruption of fuel supply chains increased operational costs for airlines and logistic operators, while regional energy shortages drove up heating and transportation prices. Trade partners such as China and India, reliant on predictable Russian logistics, faced elevated insurance premiums and delivery delays, demonstrating that Ukraine's strikes had immediate repercussions for global commerce. Energy and defense analysts emphasize that the disruption of refinery operations compounded by targeted attacks on power grids could have lasting implications for industrial output, particularly in sectors dependent on consistent energy supplies. The attacks also forced Russia into a dilemma regarding its air defense priorities. Each drone swarm required rapid allocation of S-400 and Panzer batteries, stretching defensive systems thin. Military experts commenting in Defense News explained that this balancing act between defending frontline troops and protecting critical industrial hubs illustrates the strategic advantage Ukraine gains from unmanned saturation tactics. Such maneuvers do not merely inflict damage, they compel the adversary to make choices that reduce operational efficiency and increase vulnerability, a point emphasized by NATO tactical analysts during briefings on Eastern European security. Additionally, the coordination of these attacks reflects an evolution in Ukrainian military doctrine. Rather than focusing solely on conventional engagement, forces are increasingly leveraging asymmetric tactics, targeting logistics, energy, and communication nodes to create systemic disruption. The broader consequence is clear. The lines between battlefield and homeland have blurred, compelling Russia to defend not only occupied territories, but also its domestic economic and social infrastructure. As citizens endured blackout conditions, fuel shortages, and extreme cold, the Kremlin's narrative of stability faltered. Analysts from the NYT and Al Jazeera agreed that the combination of physical disruption and psychological pressure could have a decisive impact on Russian resilience. The night's events demonstrated that modern conflict extends beyond military formations to include societal and economic dimensions, raising an urgent question: can Moscow restore domestic stability while sustaining offensive operations abroad, or has the war entered a phase of dual-front vulnerability? Russia's air defense apparatus found itself in an untenable position. Faced with fleets of Ukrainian drones and precision-guided attacks, Moscow was forced into an impossible allocation of resources, protect frontline units, or shield critical infrastructure at home. Every activation of the S-400 and Panzer batteries to defend airports, refineries, and power grids came at the cost of coverage along the Ukrainian front, creating a strategic dilemma highlighted in reports from Jane's Defense Weekly. NATO analysts quickly recognized the implications. Ukraine's asymmetric campaign was not only inflicting immediate damage, but also eroding Russia's operational flexibility. The question emerging for observers and policymakers alike: how can a state project military power abroad when the home front is under siege? Economically, the strain was equally acute. The cascading effects of fuel shortages disrupted flights, and damaged industrial infrastructure forced Russian companies to absorb mounting costs. Insurance premiums for aviation and freight surged, regional fuel prices skyrocketed, and transportation bottlenecks hampered trade with Asia and Europe. Economist Dr. Martin Kessler, commenting for Reuters, noted, Russia's logistical chains are now experiencing pressure points in multiple nodes simultaneously. Each disrupted refinery, each closed airport multiplies the economic impact far beyond the immediate strike zone. NATO countries monitored these disruptions closely, recognizing that weakened Russian economic throughput could indirectly stabilize contested zones in Ukraine. by constraining Moscow's capacity to supply and reinforce its forces. Strategically, the psychological component cannot be overstated. Images of stranded passengers, powerless urban centers, and burning refineries undermined Moscow's narrative of control. Analysts at Al Jazeera highlighted that by forcing citizens to confront the war directly within their own cities, Ukraine successfully leveraged psychological operations to complement kinetic effects. Western military commentators emphasized that this dual approach, economic disruption combined with visible vulnerability, shapes both domestic perception and international diplomatic leverage. Putin's assertion of unbroken authority faced tangible challenges as citizens directly witnessed infrastructure failure and logistical chaos. The operational success of Ukraine's drone and deep strike campaigns also revealed gaps in Russia's command and control systems. Deploying limited defensive assets against a multi-front asymmetric threat required rapid high-stakes decision-making. Each misallocation risked both civilian and military losses, illustrating a core vulnerability in Russian defense doctrine that NATO intelligence had long anticipated. Western experts argued that the inability to efficiently prioritize defensive actions underlines the broader strategic cost of Ukraine's evolving capabilities. It is not merely the damage inflicted, but the forced recalibration of Russian military operations that constitutes a lasting impact. Meanwhile, geopolitical ramifications extended beyond the immediate conflict. Disrupted flights and energy bottlenecks affected international trade and logistics, particularly for nations maintaining economic ties with Russia under Western sanctions. Analysts from The Guardian and Defense News suggested that the resulting economic strain could influence Moscow's diplomatic posture, with potential implications for arms negotiations, energy exports, and NATO's regional force posture. Ukraine's strikes thus served multiple strategic objectives: immediate military disruption, long-term economic pressure, and a psychological message that Russia's interior is no longer inviolable. As the dust settled over Moscow and surrounding regions, the reality crystallized. Russia's air defense dilemma, compounded by civilian disruption and economic strain, forced a reevaluation of operational priorities. NATO observers highlighted that Ukraine had effectively shifted the pressure point to Moscow, compelling a defensive response that weakened frontline efficacy. The pressing cliffhanger remained: would continued deep strike operations expose additional vulnerabilities, potentially forcing Moscow to withdraw resources from offensive campaigns to protect the homeland, further altering the conflict's trajectory? The timing of Ukraine's strikes was no accident. Occurring just before the scheduled Trump-Zelensky meeting, the attacks conveyed a powerful diplomatic message: Ukraine was capable of projecting force deep into Russian territory, challenging Moscow's narrative of invulnerability. Analysts from Defense News and The Guardian highlighted that by demonstrating operational reach and precision, Ukraine reframed the negotiation table's agenda. The discussion was no longer about incremental territorial concessions. It now encompassed the sustainability of Russia's domestic and military resilience. The key question for viewers and policymakers alike: how does a nation negotiate effectively when its adversary's homeland is under direct operational threat? Strategically, these operations had immediate ripple effects on NATO and Western planning. By exposing gaps in Russian air defense and logistics, the strikes provided allies with real-time data on vulnerabilities and force allocation priorities. NATO intelligence briefings suggested that Ukraine's deep strike capabilities could serve as a deterrent, influencing Russian troop movements and reshaping the calculus for potential escalatory measures. Analysts from Jane's Defense Weekly noted that the combination of kinetic strikes, infrastructure disruption, and psychological impact created a multi-layered pressure point, demonstrating the effectiveness of integrating modern unmanned systems with conventional military strategy. Western military experts also emphasize the broader geopolitical significance. By demonstrating the ability to strike key infrastructure like airports and refineries, Ukraine signaled to the Trump administration and other global stakeholders that it can enforce consequences for aggression without full-scale escalation. Energy policy specialists noted that the disruption of fuel supplies and regional logistics had knock-on effects on European energy security and global commodity flows, adding weight to Ukraine's bargaining power. The attacks illustrated a sophisticated understanding of the interplay between military action, economic pressure, and diplomatic signaling. The cumulative effect of the December 27th strikes shattered the Kremlin's carefully constructed image of control. Domestic propaganda touting stability and invulnerability was contradicted by images of Moscow's paralyzed airports, burning refineries, and power outages. Dr. Elena Novikova, a sociopolitical analyst, emphasized that the visible vulnerability of Russian citizens to the conflict undermined public confidence, potentially impacting recruitment morale and political legitimacy. From a Western perspective, this demonstrated the efficacy of combining direct military pressure with strategic information dissemination. Looking forward, the implications for the next phase of the conflict are profound. Ukraine has set a precedent for future deep strike operations, signaling both capability and intent. NATO and U.S. military planners are closely monitoring the evolution of Ukraine's drone swarms and precision targeting, considering the impact on Allied defense strategies and deterrence posture. The ongoing challenge for Russia is clear: defend domestic infrastructure while maintaining offensive operations abroad, all under intense international scrutiny. The pressing cliffhanger lingers: can Moscow adapt to this dual-front pressure, or will Ukraine's integrated strategy reshape the strategic landscape permanently? The December 27th Ukrainian strikes marked a turning point in the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Over 600 missiles and drones targeted Kyiv, inflicting severe civilian and infrastructural damage. Ukraine's counteroffensive penetrated deep into Russian airspace, closing Moscow airports, stranding passengers, and exposing vulnerabilities previously hidden behind the Kremlin's narrative of invulnerability. Precision strikes on the Syzran oil refinery disrupted Russia's fuel supply, threatening frontline operations and regional economies, while widespread power outages and winter conditions intensified civilian hardship. Analysts from NATO and Western media emphasize the strategic and psychological impact. Russia is forced to defend both its homeland and occupied territories, simultaneously stretching air defenses and logistics to the breaking point. Ukraine's use of drone swarms, precision targeting, and economic disruption demonstrates an integrated strategy blending military, psychological, and diplomatic pressure. The attacks reached beyond immediate military gains, influencing global trade, energy security, and diplomatic negotiations, including the Trump-Zelensky meeting. For NATO and the West, these operations highlight both Russian vulnerabilities and the evolving nature of modern conflict, where infrastructure and civilian exposure are critical battlegrounds. Looking ahead, the key question remains: can Russia sustain offensive operations while defending its domestic infrastructure under constant threat? Or will Ukraine's strategy redefine the conflict's balance permanently? Subscribe to stay updated on ongoing analyses, strategic insights, and breaking developments in this rapidly evolving conflict.